Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm David Geiger, your host. I've been on Iowa TV and radio for the last decade, and I am excited to join you on this podcast, Farm Here Daily. Today on the program, a look at the latest renewable fuel volume obligation proposal and an announcement just today from the Supreme Court on small refinery exemptions. Grant Kimberly with the Iowa Biodiesel Board will chat with us about that. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining us on Farm Here Daily, we have Grant Kimberly, Executive Director of the Iowa Biodiesel Board. Grant, it's always great to chat with you. And how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks, Dave, for having me.
Absolutely. We have some really interesting stuff to talk about. Last week, we had the new renewable fuel standard proposals from the EPA. And then earlier today, we had the Supreme Court announcement. So let's start first and catch up with what we are seeing right now in terms of last week's announcement. What is the overview for the folks in biodiesel here in Iowa?
Yeah, so last week, the EPA came out with their projected 2026 and 2027 volume targets for the renewable fuel standard program, the RVO, renewable volume obligation, as it's termed, and they proposed in RINs needed to satisfy that part of the program here in those next couple of years. And then within that, which is a different way that they've done it from the past relative to the biomass-based diesel category. That in the past has just been done purely in a volume target in gallons. This time they did it in RINs, but they also did it in a different way where imported feedstock turned into biodiesel or renewable diesel, or imported fuel that was biodiesel or renewable diesel would only receive half of the RIN value that they would normally receive if it was otherwise domestically sourced or produced. So that's a little bit different. So then we had to do the math a little bit to figure out what does that actually mean in gallons, because in the end, that's what matters. How many gallons does it look like the program is going to need this next year? And then what will kind of run rates would the industry need to work to run at in order to achieve those targets? And it comes out to about 5.61 billion gallons in 2026. So that's what we're estimating, or that's what EPA is estimating. And, provided that they finalize it in a very similar way to what's being proposed, that should be what happens over the next year.
So just looking at those numbers, of the 9.02 billion gallons for advanced biofuels proposed by the EPA, 5.61 billion will be biomass-based diesel, and that is primarily what you work with at the Iowa Biodiesel Board.
Yeah, that's right. 5.61 billion gallons biodiesel and renewable diesel. So they would be both of those categories would fit into that.
Could you demonstrate the scope of change that shows from previous years?
Yes, and off the top of my head, I forget the exact number right now, but
we can do estimates.
Yeah, the estimates though, we were around the 3 billion gallon category before, so it's a little over that. So it was a pretty sizable increase, but as we've seen in the marketplace, we've been struggling here recently because of depressed RIN credit values, which are the credits that are associated with the program compliance, because we had targets that were set a few years prior to this, well under where our biofuel production capacity and actual production was hitting us at. So, and that just depressed values and made it very unprofitable for the industry to continue to produce, and put a lot of the industry in a very tough financial position. So we had I would say, below what we should have had values, extremely low values. So this, in a way, it is a big increase year over year, but we're just trying to now get closer to righting the ship of where it actually should have been in the first place.
Grant, let's shelve this for now. I have a couple more questions that I'll get to a little bit later because I want to jump right into the other big news event, and that is actually of the day. It just came out. The Supreme Court is made some decisions on how small refinery exemptions are treated in the courts. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a term called small refinery exemptions. Under the program, if they met certain qualifications, an independent small refinery that couldn't really reasonably comply with some of the blending targets because they are, considered the obligated parties. A lot of the refiners, oil industry refiners, are relative to the program. They couldn't comply with some of those blending targets under the renewable fuels program. They could apply for what was called a small refinery exemption. Now, that definition was pretty narrow. At least it was always assumed to be pretty narrow. And then there were some different interpretations on that and maybe an expansion beyond what I think most of the industry believed it should have been. And a lot more of those were granted in the past. And then the courts got involved, and there was court cases that said those shouldn't have been granted, then they should have been granted, and it's bounced like a volley in a tennis match back and forth to different courts and different rulings. And there's been a holdup where then a lot of those weren't granted, but they still are out there. And now, there's a recent ruling of where this the next court case is going to be held at. And that's kind of what we're talking about now. And so we've got to see where EPA comes down on this. Now, there was conversations with the Trump administration in their first administration where they had agreed to reallocate any exempted gallons from any legitimate small refineries that qualified back into the program. So the volume targets that we just talked about a little bit ago actually meant something, and they weren't eroded by small refinery exemptions that happened after the fact, after the volume targets were already set. And then in essence, you have lower volume targets if you have more exemptions. So the agreement in the last administration was that those gallons would be reallocated in the program, and other obligated parties, the other oil industry refineries, would have to absorb those additional gallons. So the actual volume targets we talked about early were what they said they were is what they actually were. And so that's what this debate's about. And right now we're looking at, another court case is going to happen, but the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit is it looks like where the next venue of this court challenge will be held at.
Now, as I understand it, this is significant because the Supreme Court essentially decided that this is a national issue at scope, and so the small refineries that were making these claims can't just go around and potentially choose a court that would be more lenient towards them.
Yeah, that would be part of it. And bottom line is if we allowed 12 different circuit courts across the country to adjudicate SRE validity, that would result in a fractured and, a mess of an inconsistency, a body of law and rulings. So it would cause chaos in the marketplace and confusion, and that's something that we just don't want to see, and that just doesn't make any sense. So you need to have all of these adjudicated in one court because it is a national program, and so that's what we're looking forward to here, for the next steps. So we just basically need solutions on the pending SREs in the past. We got to have resolution of this here, hopefully sooner than later. And we just want to make sure that they don't undermine any current requirements or the targets and any future growth we might see in the biomass-based diesel industry from our perspective. And likewise, the ethanol industry would have the same view from the ethanol side of things.
This is Farm Here Daily. We'll continue our conversation with Grant in just a moment, but first let's take a look at the Wednesday market close. July corn up 2 cents, 4.33.5. September rising 5 1/4 at 4.29. Soybeans in July 3/4 of a penny higher at 10.74 3/4, with August 1/2 cent higher at 10.76 3/4. Soybean meal in July 20 cents a ton in the red at $284.90. July wheat 25 1/4 more, 5.74 1/4, with September rising 25 cents at $5.90.5 a bushel. In the livestock market close for Wednesday, June live cattle up $1.05 a hundredweight, $224.30. August rising $1.02 at $211.67. Feeder cattle in August 82 cents a hundredweight higher at $304.17, with September rising 90 cents at $303.80. Lean hogs in July 52 cents a hundredweight more at $112.17, with August 20 cents in the green at $112 even a hundredweight. That is the Wednesday market close. This is Farm Here Daily. We are speaking with Grant Kimberly, Executive Director of the Iowa Biodiesel Board. Grant, I want to return to earlier in the conversation when you were talking about RINs, renewable identification numbers. Could you tell me more about that acronym and what it means for Iowa Biodiesel?
Yeah, so when volume of biofuel is sold, and there's a RIN, renewable identification number, credit value associated with them, and they're basically all, the baseline is calculated off of the ethanol equivalency rate, basically, and the energy content. So when it comes to biofuel, biodiesel, and renewable diesel, for instance, biodiesel receives 1.5 RINs per gallon of fuel sold. Renewable diesel in the past received 1.7 RINs per gallon of diesel fuel sold. Now this was also changed in the most recent ruling. They will receive 1.6 RINs per volume of gallon renewable diesel sold, and which actually is more fair this way because it narrows the differential between biodiesel and renewable diesel when it comes to the RIN credit. And there's a dollar figure that, dollar amount, it fluctuates like any marketplace. It changes all the time. There's a dollar amount that is associated with those RIN credits. And so if you generate 1.5 RINs per gallon, and the more gallons you generate, the more RINs you generate, and you just have to multiply it and do the math from that point. So, depending on how many gallons you sell. So that's really how the program works in general from a biomass-based diesel perspective.
A huge point of this is because not every facility would be able to create biodiesel in this way. And so in order to maintain compliance with renewable volume obligations like the ones proposed last week, you have to be able to trade in one way or another, or purchase in one way or another facility's ability to do that.
Yeah, that's how it works. Some people will blend. Again, the obligation requirement is on the petroleum refinery to blend these gallons. They're the ones that have to then turn in these RIN credits to EPA at the end of the day to say they've met whatever percentage target relative to the overall fuel sector that they represent, that they need to blend. But there are some in the industry, if they can either blend the physical wet gallon, they'll get the RIN associated with it, and then they can retire that RIN to the EPA. Or there's others, and truck stops are an example. They might blend gallons directly from the biodiesel industry, renewable diesel industry, and then the biodiesel industry, a biodiesel producer, and the truck stop can then they separate those RINs, and then they end up selling it on a basically like a third party trading system. And then others. And then, so in that case, the biodiesel plant receives monetary value for that, and the truck stop will pay that, and then they in turn resell that to maybe an obligated party, a petroleum refinery, who needs to meet those obligations if they didn't have enough physical wet gallons that they already blended themselves. And that's kind of how the market trades back and forth. There's different industry participants and different areas in the value chain that can use it in different ways, but those credits are able to be monetized, and that's another way to help build out infrastructure and help with the margin structure to make sure that those biofuels are cost competitive into the marketplace.
So with that RIN explanation back in our mind, we had this proposal last week that included 5.61 billion gallons estimated of biomass-based diesel. What does that number physically look like from a state perspective? How much could Iowa potentially contribute to that?
The state of Iowa, with our production capacity of biodiesel, we're We're just a biodiesel producer at this point. We are the largest soy crusher, soy processor in the country, of course. So we make a lot of feedstock, and we have also animal fat that can go into the feedstock mix, and corn oil from the ethanol industry can go into the feedstock mix. But from a biodiesel production capacity standpoint, we would have about 450 million gallons of capacity, give or take. And that's roughly where we're at now. I think the industry could easily expand down the road if the market signals were there. So we could probably grow over time, but that's roughly where we're at. And we've been under those actual volume targets for the last couple of years because of the depressed nature of the marketplace, because the EPA several years ago missed the targets pretty badly as far as where it needed to be. And that's kind of slowed down the industry a little bit. But we're hoping this will right the ship and we can kind of start moving things forward a little bit better here in the near future.
I think that's important to note because I recall 10 years ago, it was a common concern that the proposals of renewable volume obligations were not enough to actually stir the industry. And so we had more capacity than what folks were willing to purchase. With this,
Yep.
you mentioned that there is possibility for expansion. Does 2 years of this proposal merit an expansion?
That's a good question. I think it gets us back to where we need to be. I don't know that we would see a big expansion yet off of that, off of this alone. I think we'd have to see further growth on the volume targets beyond this to see that happen. And then there's a third piece of the puzzle here, and that is the tax credit. As we talk about the reconciliation process and the big, beautiful bill that's being worked on tax policy, there are biofuel credits that may or may not be associated with that bill. We did have the biodiesel tax credit, what we called the biodiesel blenders tax credit, the BTC, just expired at the end of this last year. And that was another piece of the puzzle. And there has not been anything that's put into place yet to replace that. 45Z is something that it was talked about in the last administration, but it wasn't finalized. And so they're working on that right now. And so depending on how that shakes out, that'll also play a factor in if we see additional growth or expansion.
As a side note, it's a little bit unrelated, but slightly, because you just mentioned it right there. The Inflation Reduction Act has been targeted, and the Big Beautiful Bill wants to do certain tax reductions. Do you think renewable fuels could be a casualty of some of this renewable targeting that's been happening on the national level?
Well, certainly, our industry has been working hard to make sure that we're still included in the mix with some of the different tax credits that might also be part of any bill like this. And so far, the House passed bill did have an extension of the 45Z tax credit in it. It was only for domestically North American produced feedstocks, though, that would be eligible. Imported feedstocks would not be eligible, according to the House bill. And now proposal that we've just seen here this week from the Senate side is it would also be in their version of the bill, but they would allow foreign feedstocks to receive 80% of the whatever credit value 45Z would end up at. So there's a little difference there, and there's some other components too. But right now, both versions of the bill do have some component of 45Z put in place, and those tax credits would vary depending on feedstock mix. So what the type of feedstock would based off of its carbon intensity, and that would determine what the credit value would be. One really important piece of the legislation on both the House and Senate side is that they've reduced the carbon accounting method, or they've eliminated the carbon accounting method called indirect land use change. That's a penalty that penalizes U.S. row crop agriculture for things that are really outside of their control that happen in other countries. Basically penalized for expansion of agriculture production in places like Brazil. And so unfortunately, thankfully, we're looking at these two bills both eliminate the usage of that theory that was used in some carbon accounting methodology and equations. And if you look at just carbon accounting based off of carbon reduction of a feedstock on its direct land use change and its direct emissions, row crop agriculture looks really good and does a really good job at achieving those goals. And so that's how the 45Z credit methodology would work in a general sense. And both of these bills, the House and Senate versions, it looks like we're going to have some version of these credits survive. And so that's going to be positive for the biofuel industry. And that would help us see potentially additional expansion in future years when you put that in conjunction with a growing RFS volume target.
Putting us right back on track then, all these three notes we've made, the 45Z tax credit, the renewable volume obligations, and the Supreme Court announcement, would you say that's a good thing then for the Iowa producer?
Yes, if all these things get finalized this way. Remember, these things are not final yet. So
yes,
there's the horse isn't in the barn yet, so to speak. So we still got a ways to go, but the proposals are good so far, and we look like we're trending in the right direction. That would be very positive. And we've seen that here recently in the trading of the soybean oil market, how it's been up dramatically in anticipation of additional use of soybean oil going into the biofuel industry. And so that would be, we think this could be all positive. But again, we've got a few more I's to dot and T's to cross to get things finalized and over the finish line before we know for sure that that's going to be the case. But if we can see this happen, it will be good for U.S. soybean farmers, Iowa farmers. It'll be good for U.S. biofuel producers and Iowa biofuel producers if we can get there. We're not there yet, but we're moving in the right direction, hopefully.
Then the last question I have to ask is, if you were able to insert something or add something into this mix, what would you think is the most important thing for Iowa Biodiesel to have and move forward towards next?
Well, we kind of need all of these things to fall into place. So you can't really just say one's going to be enough, I don't think. But we need all these pieces to fall into place. But we're moving in the right direction on the RFS volume target. We're moving in the right direction, it appears, on the 45Z tax credit target, although the debate on whether or not foreign feedstocks qualify for credits is still out there, and we'll have to see where that lands and if it's somewhere in the middle of where the House and the Senate version was proposed. And I would say there is one other policy piece that's being talked about out there that maybe isn't as widely known, is there was a program in the past called a small producer credit. So there was another credit program, a small producer credit geared towards the small, as the name says, small biofuel producers who would get a little, I would call it additional bonus credit that they could be eligible for. And there's talk about whether or not we can see that tacked on to the actual 45Z process. So maybe that would, in a way, what that does is it would help maybe the smaller independent biodiesel producers compete a little bit better against the very large integrated oil refinery participants in the market, or large integrated processors, crushers who are also biodiesel producers. So if you think about in terms of the smaller independent biodiesel producer, they still have some challenges because they have to buy feedstock on the open market. They're not integrated. They don't have can't just pipe it over from one side of the plant to the other, or they're not massive multi-billion-dollar, multinational oil companies, that have deep pockets and huge resources. So if you think about the independent biodiesel producer, who are mostly owned by small town, local Main Street investors, a lot of farmer investors, how do we make sure that they can continue to compete on a level playing field? And that's where the small producer credit, if we can get something like that through, could also maybe make a difference for those, that segment of the industry. So that's the other piece that's still hanging out there a little bit. But I think, we got to do one thing at a time here. And so we're working through these other pieces first.
Grant Kimberly, he is the executive director of the Iowa Biodiesel Board. I'm so thankful that you joined us on the program. I really learned a lot today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, David, for having me. It's complicated marketplace and program, that's for sure, but it's a very important program to U.S. agriculture and our U.S. energy independence, and helps reduce our dependence on foreign oil, creates good, high-paying jobs in rural America, and also as part of our national security and improves the emissions profile and reduces carbon. So there's something in this industry for everybody, no matter what's most important to you, because the industry provides a lot of different value and benefits to the whole country. And so, but it starts with the farmers. And so that's why we're hopeful that we can continue to make good progress in these areas.
Thanks again, Grant. This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. In order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast, send it over to your friends, and check out our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. Additionally, you can find me on social media at Geiger Reports. You can also see me on WHO TV Channel 13 every weekday in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.